Thank you, everyone, and even better. I don't have to speak and I get claps yet. Great. All right. Excited to be here today. Just start a little bit about myself, and actually, it sounds like the mic's picking up well. I am not great at standing at a podium. I love to walk around and interact, so I will do my best to stay tethered. So I'm during the day. I'm the CEO of Nisos. We're a managed service for cyber threat intelligence. That's all we're going to talk about that today. Just from background, I have a lot of experience building and running managed services businesses, but also early in my career led computer security globally at General Electric. So before you got the CISO title, but so I've been a practitioner and before joining the dark vendor world. I also do a lot in the industry. I'm a fellow at George Mason's National Security Institute. Have some search for anyone who cares about that. I'm passionate about building great things in what was information security and now cybersecurity. So we're talking about adversary modeling today, and a model that I developed called Adversary ROI. So I'll go through some context. I'll talk about why why I'm not a big believer in traditional ROI or return on security investment. We'll talk about how we categorize threat actors, and we'll talk about how you can take this home and apply it in your organizations. So importantly, I don't have my co-developer here with me. This has been a passion of something that Josh Corman and I have built together. Josh is now the VP of cyber safety strategy at Clarity. Josh is really passionate about how I think he'll say where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood, and the implications of what's happening in the world. So he's also founded something called I Am the Cavalry. If that's something you're passionate about, I encourage you to Google it and check it out. It's a great volunteer organization that's looking at key risks to human life in the cybersecurity realm. And he also has a great background and experience to bring context to it. So, how do we get here? The first one, I guess, if you disagree with this statement, you probably won't get a lot out of the rest of this. But I think it's really important. We all have scarce resources. That one of my I have a minor in economics, and economics is the study of the application of scarce resources. That we do. I've never found a cybersecurity leader that says I have all the resources I need to do my job perfectly. So we have to figure out how we allocate those resources those scarce resources in an intelligent way, and that means we can't protect everything uniformly. Most organizations, I also have a degree in finance, use ROI for their investment decisions, and while that I don't think is incredibly powerful for what we do, it is something that's very powerful in how we talk and communicate inside of organizations. So. I'll start with the airplane example. That airplanes are amazing systems. That if you think of how many flights happen a day, when you look at Six Sigma, you look at failure rates. Airplanes are one of the most resilient systems ever built. Much like nuclear power systems, the failure rates, the engineering that's gone into the design and resiliency of them is unbelievable. But even inside of that world, the black box, which years ago when I first looked at this was like, isn't actually black. That the black box. We protect differently, and so we make decisions around things that we need to protect more intelligently and more resiliently than others, and this is a framework to think through that. So I think one of the challenges is, and I remember this as being a practitioner, is we're now in the breach a week, maybe breach a day world, and there's I think too often a view of something that you did causes a breach, and there are definitely components of things you can do. We'll talk about activists and things, but in many cases it's who's after you, how capable or how motivated they are, what are their tactics, techniques, and procedures that often drive the negative security outcomes that we're seeing. So why has ROI failed us? Again, this is at the top of the ROI equation. It's actually pretty simple. You look at what are your expected returns from an investment over the cost of investment, and you get a value, and then there's some if you're not a finance person, there's some finance terms that look at that, the time value of money to bring that together. So one is like most security folks aren't finance experts. But I think more importantly, this is typically applied in a vacuum. That you're looking at a project and like, hey, should I invest in identity management? Should I invest in VPN? Should I invest in this particular cloud security protection? And so we have very complex systems and they're difficult to connect. But I think importantly, there's no actual gains. We're talking about risk reduction that outside of perhaps some cloud providers and consulting companies, that cybersecurity is not a profit center. And I think the most important part is it actually doesn't determine the efficacy or the consequent investment levels. That I very rarely see this applied in a way that's saying, well, if we invest X, we get Y return. If we get Z, we get A return. To have the intelligent conversation. So I think examples like you look at this like hard question: does the club have ROI? For those of you that aren't familiar with it, the club's a $50 device. Years ago, it had great infomercials. You can still buy it at most auto parts stores, and it's something you clamp across your steering wheel, and you turn a key on the lock, and in theory, prevents the car from being stolen. Again, if you have one of those 10 popular most stolen cars, putting it on your car probably isn't the worst use of $50. But is it going to stop a motivated adversary? No. Like for years, I had one because I had a popular stolen car, and I wouldn't lock it because if a motivated thief got in the car and they get clubs off, they cut the steering wheels. And so once they cut your steering wheel, if you actually recover your car, you have a higher cost of repair. Is it a useful visual deterrent? Sure. Does it protect your catalytic converter, your radio, someone who uses a tow truck take your car? No. And I think that's the conversations that are really challenging to have. If you think of that, try to have that conversation about purchasing a unified identity management system with a non-security person. So, from the failures of return on investment came return on security investment. And I think this is something that, if there's folks that have managed to adopt FAIR or some other amazing frameworks, you may disagree with a little bit of what I'll say here. Again, I think this is amazing, and I think if we could get to the point where we had maturity around this, it'd be a different conversation. But I think for most organizations, the complexity of security investment is too complicated. And some of the reasons for that is, there's a huge market now for attack surface management tools, and I'm yet to find a company that actually can properly define their attack surface. Our attack surfaces are approaching infinity. That's an incredibly difficult challenge. Risk mitigated can also be subjective. A number is that we'll talk about activists and ideologically motivated actors, and those are very different than there's a particular financial loss associated with a breach can have costs directly connected to notifications. It can have recovery costs. We can have a number of different hard costs. The cost of our business being down and not being able to operate. But things like consumer trust are much harder to put numbers on, and therefore it lacks accuracy. So I think this is what happens in the real world. Return on security investment is we make an assumption, we multiply it by a wild ass guess, and subtract a hunch from it, divide by a hunch. And some finance person's really happy if you're a good security leader. You do this in a way that's compelling. You get your investment. Everyone smiles, moves on, and we roll things out. But it's not something that I think is inspiring the confidence in risk management that we'd all really aspire to have. And I think importantly, the adversary doesn't care about any of this. And this was the thing for Josh and I that struck was, they have their own ROI model. And I think that we started this before organized crime had really gotten truly organized. So this research we started back in, I think, 2008. I think we first published it in 2012. I remember talking with a group of finance leaders along with the Secret Service, and I asked the question. I said, how much money do you think an organized crime group could spend on an exploit? And this was like 2010, and they said, we're seeing groups that have $1 million R&D groups. And you think about if they're willing to make $1 million investment, what type of returns are they expecting back? And that's something that I still think we could do a better job of communicating that to our constituents outside of the cybersecurity realm. So our adversaries are very results oriented. We'll talk about some of their different motivations. It's not always financial, but they care about the investment they're making. Are they getting the returns on it? So that brings us to adversary ROI. So why is this approach valuable? Also we'll chat. We say a lot of our investment is, a lot of our conversations around vulnerability, and this is a way of shifting that conversation. We've talked about our attack surface being too large and our failures to prioritize. But importantly, our adversaries have scarce resources too. There are some like China that have amazingly large organizations, but not everyone's like that. And when you think through, if you take the MITRE ATT&CK framework and you think about how you disrupt. When you force them to use scarce resources differently, it changes their ROI and changes how they have to prioritize how they work. So, if you think about risk, in a lot of organizations, we still have a current state of looking at vulnerability. Where are we vulnerable? We'll try this out. I'm not a big fan of the term. I'm a very big fan of threat modeling. I'm not a very big fan of the term threat modeling because I think it's more attack modeling. But we look at a lot of the state of our vulnerability, and that's a really important variable. But we also have to look at threat and consequences. A risk requires a threat and a vulnerability that results in a negative consequence. A threat that doesn't have a vulnerability is a so what. A vulnerability without a threat is a so what. And bringing that adversary ROI is a way of bringing that into our conversations. So, what is a threat? Threats are a who, not a what. A threat is an actor that has a capability and a motive. We actually, my day job, we see a lot of intelligence around actors who have motives with no capability. And so that, if you have someone who is, who wants to target you but doesn't have the ability to do it, they're a so what. But importantly, there's a who behind it. And I think importantly, this is something that I hope I'm preaching to the choir in the room, but I think is a really powerful conversation you can have with executives. That if you think about how we manage vulnerabilities, I'm tethered. A new vulnerability shows up. It's available for the adversary. That whether 0 day, at day zero, there's something available for the adversary to use as a tool. We have to go through a cycle where we figure out how to protect against that, whether it's a patch to remove the vulnerability, whether it's a detection to know that it's being attacked, a mitigation, even better if we can automate the ability to, if we can't cover the vulnerability, automate our ability to respond to it. And that has to go through an entire adoption curve. Not everyone adopts overnight. And so while the attackers are adopting it, we have to get to the second curve where, we have something to defend against it. Again, whether a patch, a detection, or a mitigation. And then we have to go through the adoption curve that I'm sure some of the larger organizations in here have very significant change management boards, have incredibly complex systems that a change can have significant consequences. And so if we live in this world where we're always reacting, we will always definitionally be behind. And I think this is something that, I've explained this to some business leaders in this format. And they're like, oh, this now makes sense, which, probably for us, again, but a really powerful message. And I think importantly, so value favors the attacker. I got to an opportunity years ago. Actually, one of the things that led to this research is I did some work when I was at Fidelity Security Systems with one of the branches of the military, and we were looking at how nation-state actors were attempting to exfiltrate critical military intellectual property. And I was in a room with some kind of one-star generals, and I said, why spend $1 billion developing it if you could steal it for $1 million? And the idea that this was 2008. The idea that an adversary could spend $1 million wasn't top of mind. Again, if you're China, if you're North Korea, if you're Russia, if you have military capabilities that you're behind in that you need to develop, the cost of stealing it is almost always cheaper than the cost of developing it. And so, the more, we have a fixed, we listen, executives listen to Gartner. They say, hey, an IT security budget in this industry should be X percent of, X percent of revenue, X percent of spend, X percent of IT. But as we get to from, obviously protecting our reputation and public data, we get to replaceable data like credit cards, but highly irreplaceable data like our intellectual property or key things that protect human life. This equation becomes really challenging for defenders. So how do we think about the adversary's ROI? That, again, first, they have a attack value. What are they trying to accomplish? What is the value to them of the attack? Over the, divided by the cost of the attack. So it's pretty simple to the traditional ROI model. Then there's a probability of success, and then there is the impact of deterrence measures. So as you look at this, very rarely you're going to go, you know what? I'm going to make this attack less valuable by making my company, my assets, my people, whatever it is, less valuable. So that's a variable you generally can't control. We'll talk at the end about work effort, that when you increase the cost of attack, it changes that variable significantly. And our ability to detect, respond, and recover is critical. It impacts every component of the equation. And I think there's very few folks. We probably have some law enforcement folks. A lot of us, the deterrence measures are not something that we can impact. That if you're in a country that doesn't prosecute cyber criminals, like I can't remember. There's a country in South America that at least a few years ago. The largest penalty for computer crime was a $1,000 penalty and 30 days in jail, and they didn't have an extradition agreement with the United States. And so there's places where deterrence capability, that's a thing that's beyond most of our control, unless you're in law enforcement or you're in a large organization that has the ability to lobby and influence the legislative branch. So, think about bike theft. If you're an adversary, if you're in a place where, as you think through it, are there a lot of bikes? Is there a market for those bikes? So if I steal a bike, is it easy to sell it on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, other places? Can you build an ROI equation of is there a lot of them that are easy to steal? Are they easy to monetize? On the outside, deterrence measures. How good is the police department of finding these things? Of finding criminals? Are people taking their serial numbers of stolen bikes and listing them so that they're harder to sell in the aftermarket marketplace? And then, how well are those bikes protected? I think it's interesting is bikes are a good example. We generally protect our bike frames. When you lock a bike, very few people lock the seat and the handlebars and the wheel. No one locks the brakes, and so we make decisions based on what's the risk of theft and where we are. Are we leaving the bike out overnight? Are we in a high theft area? From the adversary's perspective, they're looking at it from how easy is to get this bike, but also how easy it is to monetize it. What's the likelihood I'll get caught in the monetization process? So we'll shift from there because I think the really important part of the equation is modeling our adversaries. So I think one of you'll hear in cybersecurity, well, I don't have to be, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun my friend, and that's dogma. There are certain cases where that may be true that we'll talk through, but broadly that does not apply to the problem set that we're dealing with. I think that this is something that that Josh and I worked through was looking at we have a pantheon of adversary classes that we have to deal with. If you work in a large organization, I had the fortune of starting my career at General Electric. I had to deal with all of this. But as we'll talk through the model, that's not common for most organizations. So at the top, we look at actor classes. What are the different types of adversaries we could deal with? We have nation states. We have competitors. Again, in the U.S., we don't often think of competitive espionage. I'll tell you, in Southeast Asia, if you are not pushing the envelope on competitive espionage, you're not considered to be doing your job. We have organized crime, we have script kiddies, we have terrorists, we have hacktivists or activists, we have insider threat, and one of the things that Josh is always really passionate about is that we have auditors, because auditors distract us from a lot of the things we need to do to protect elsewhere. Again, the actors have motivations. They have financial, industrial. It could be looking for money. It could be looking for intellectual property. They could be military in nature. They could be ideological or political. And there's some that just do it, for the lulz or the prestige to show that they think that they're important, or for their egos. There's a number of different asset sets that we target. This is probably a simplified list, but but each of these is very different in their attributes. We have impacts. We have the traditional, confidentiality, integrity, availability triad, but we also have reputation and personal impacts that come along with it. So doxing or reputation impacts. And then there's a number of different methods from what's available in the Metasploit toolkit, for a script kiddie to a number of different methods. And when you look at this, you go, man, that's overwhelming. Like, our jobs are really hard. But when you start to break it down, you realize is that this isn't in play for everyone. And there's a lot of folks that will say, oh, there's this actor class, and connect it to the bottom of their TTPs. And the premise is that the connectivity in the middle is critically important. So take an activist actor. Their motivation is ideological. They would typically target web properties from a reputation perspective or data to steal. Pretty broad impact from a types of impact perspective, because they can get their ideological point of view made a number of different ways. But they generally don't have a very sophisticated toolkit. Ideological actors don't tend to have the organization of a more mature group like an organized crime or nation state. They don't have R&D budgets. They are generally kept to the tool sets that are available to publicly publicly or already leaked in their tool sets. And so if this is an actor set that you need to deal with, you can start to think differently about how you apply your security controls. So I won't go through them in detail in this presentation, but if you look at out on SlideShare and some other places, we've actually built some kind of baseball card models that go through each of the actors. And I think it's important to review these over time, because they will change. Like, as an example, back to the ideological actor, if you remember back, Anonymous ran Operation Robin Hood, where they stole a bunch of credit cards and then tried to and then use those to donate money to a charity that they supported. And at the time, you would go, well, that didn't fit their typical MO. They only did it once because they realized actually that all those credit card charges got disputed. The charities they were trying to support got chargeback charges. They actually ended up costing the charities they were working with money, and so that was a one-time motive. We'll talk about false flags toward the end, but you can look at these individual from the script kiddie to the old Russian business network to the nation state APT actors to activists and others, and you can build these much like a MITRE attack framework. You can build these chains of the who, what, why, how approaches. So obviously as some examples, a strip kitty is typically in it for profit or prestige. They typically target things, often credit card numbers, but things that are fungible. It is very difficult to sell stolen intellectual property. It is very, even if the prices in the underground are very tiny, the ability to sell financial account information or credentials or other access is simple, and they have relatively unsophisticated toolkits. Where organized crime we talked about have very organized, have R&D teams, have customer support teams that can support their tool sets, but they're in it for profit again. So still focused on things that are monetizable. Ransomware also fits in the monetizable category. So you're we're starting to see more of claiming to publish sensitive information in return for ransom. I actually think we'll see even more creative ransom things over time, like the threats of disinformation campaigns in areas. So ransom is an area that while we're getting much better around our controls around encryption, for bad, their profit motives will continue to evolve. And so you can take each of these and look at their chain and what components that you're likely to deal with. So again, you take them when you compare and contrast these threat actors. I think the important, when we look at things like time frame, target stickiness, and probability. That a casual attacker, the being faster than the bear, this is the place it does matter. If someone who is looking with a relatively unsophisticated toolkit, they will scan, find places to attack, and will likely move on. So their target stickiness is very, very low. Whereas if you upset an activist group, they're not gonna be like, oh man, bank one really ticked me off, but their security's good, so I'm gonna go target bank two. The target stickiness in that environment is very high. It's like dealing with a cyber flash mob. That they're mad, they will attempt to take that out. They will tend to be sticky in their ability to do that, and in some cases incredibly relentless in their capabilities. On the right-hand side, if you take an APT or a nation-state actor, that their target stickiness is very high. That if we're in a day job dealing with a case where a nation-state felt they needed manufacturing capabilities in a particular area, that they didn't have any expertise, that ended up having some relation to COVID and medical supply chains, and it didn't matter. There were a few places they could get that, and they ran a multi-year campaign to get that intellectual property and build their manufacturing capabilities around this particular area where they felt internal weakness due to supply chain concerns. So how do you take this and apply it in the real world? So first I'll say is, you have to understand who's attacking you. And I think I'm a huge fan of the Verizon DBIR, and there's some great data inside of this. And when Josh and I started this research, actually, the DBIR didn't break out things like patterns or industries to the extent they do today. But if you have someone who's saying, no, the adversaries don't matter, we just need to protect ourselves, there is data that shows that not to be true. So what this chart from the DBIR looks at is what is the difference between large orgs and smaller orgs. And if you look, the activist actor and the prestige motivated actor are significantly more likely to attack larger organizations than smaller organizations. And one of the first places that I got really frustrated after we published this model was when the activist DDoS happened. I remember there was an article on the cover of Bank Information Security magazine, and the title was like, "You must have DDoS protection." And all of these small regional banks went out and bought DDoS protection because Gartner, Bank Information Security magazine, told them to. And the banks that needed DDoS protection were the large ones. Anonymous was DDoSing the major banks to encourage them to do business with the smaller banks. And when you're a CISO and you have a limited budget and your CEO says you're going to go buy DDoS protection because banks have to, when you weren't about to be DDoSed because the distributor protest wasn't with you, that's a misappropriation of scarce resources. Now it turned out, thankfully, that 18 months later that became a valuable tool because organized crime started using DDoS to take down online banking systems so people couldn't see their accounts when they would do online runs at accounts or ATMs. So that investment actually did eventually become useful, but could have waited 18 months. There's the industry data in DBIR shows some great data. If you look at this is the number of attacks by industry within the underlying Verus data set that supports DBIR. And so don't worry so much with the counts. What's important is the colors. The colors, take this and weight it by industry. So obviously some industries see less attack than others. That's the way the data is normalized. And you can see if you're in the information, the manufacturing or the finance industry, you are much more likely to see denial of service attacks than other areas. So everyone's dealing with kind of core system intrusion to their basic, to the DBIR calls the basic web properties. The social engineering is kind of generally well applied, but there's different areas that based on who you are, and which then relates to who's attacking you, very different security investment is required to take the tools. So, it's really important to know who you're playing against. Again, are you playing with against a pawn? Or are you playing against the queen? When who can move anywhere on the board, and how are you going to defend yourself against it? The other place this model is really useful is in spotting false flags. I've seen this over and over. And so if you have incident response teams, you can bring this to life in your day-to-day response process. That if you've modeled your adversaries, you know what to expect. If you see a TTP that is disconnected, from reality, that it can help you steer your resources very quickly. And so, a recent example I've seen was there was a fintech that had a breach, network intrusion, and it had a number of Iranian TTPs associated with it. The board freaked out that it was a nation state actor, and was about to go into what would be a very, very expensive and complex process, both in the application of information security, incident response resources, but also in notifications likely to things like the SEC. When you connect the dots, it didn't make sense that there was a big disconnect between the systems that were being targeted, and it turned out that they had conflated two things. One, there was actually a small intrusion into a test environment. It hadn't gotten outside of it. It turned out to be a financially motivated North African actor who had a relatively didn't have they landed but didn't have the ability to expand. But also connected in their systems was a bunch of data in their logs that when it was automatically correlated to it, was some basically new testing and system rollout that when the data came together looked in their security operations environment like a really significant problem set. But when you looked and said, wait, the data that's being gone after is a test environment. Our intellectual property is not there. Our customer data is not there. What would a North Korean actor happening in that environment? It didn't connect. It drove asking the right questions to make sure that resources were applied effectively. So if you remember the equation, the work factor, the cost of the attack was the second variable. What do you look like to your adversary? Are you an escalator walking to come in, or are you the spiral staircase with no stairs that when you fall is really going to hurt? And I think that using this model, you can decide where to apply investment to look like the right versus the left. So some real life examples that I'll de-identify to protect the guilty, but these are real occurrences. So first is a defense industrial base company, very successful in selling military aviation technology, and they had. They sent 10 executives to a really important air show, and they found evidence of compromise on one of the executives. They looked at the other 9, and I think 9 of the other 10 also had fallen for a very sophisticated phishing attack, and they were trying to figure out why the 10th hadn't, and the 10th had used their personal email and had been compromised at their home email account. And so it was very clear that this adversary was likely state adversary targeting particular information about a military avionics capability being developed. And what they realized was, they rolled out they realized that their broad scale phishing protection was missing some key areas. Rather than rolling that out company-wide, they started with their executive team. And what they found was, any motivated adversary, they moved. But one of the things that's really cool about the defense industrial base and financial services are really good at information sharing. They protected their executive team with a different set of capabilities, and the attack moved down the supply chain. So something as an actor that motivated, something as simple as protecting executives differently from an education and technology perspective around phishing attacks caused a change in the adversary's ROI. This is one of my favorite because Josh and I gave this presentation at RSA UK or Europe, and the next year, this is actually part of a 3-part trilogy that we put together. And the next year, some folks came up to the audience and said, "Hey, we saw your presentation last year, and I want to thank you that we went and applied it, and it was so impactful that the work we did ended up in our company's financial statements." And it was like, whoa. And so, what was interesting was, again, pretty sophisticated bank, a top 50 international bank. And, what they looked at was, they realized their biggest risk, their biggest concerns were around, the financially motivated adversaries, stealing credentials, and liquidating accounts. And the bank was very siloed. The cybersecurity team and the fraud team were not very well connected, and they ended up cutting 10% of their traditional cybersecurity budget, putting it together in a joint budget with the fraud team. They focused on basically unifying identity and transaction monitoring, and they reduced fraud so much that it made a positive line item in their public company financial reporting. And what they said was, looking at the model gave them the guts to not to reduce spending on things that didn't matter. You come into a budget cycle, we're at that time of year right now where you're like, okay, here's the things I'm spending money on. Let's reallocate that again for next year. There's inflation, put a few % on it, and then I've got a limited amount of money left to spend. And the ability to go, man, I could actually take some of that instead of carrying it over and reallocate it to make our security more impactful was what they did. And it had, they got huge recognition and bonuses for the internally financially motivated folks for the impact that they made. So, how do you take this out of this room? One of the things I love about it is it's a great way to get executives involved in the security conversation. I'm a CEO. People don't get to the C-suite by not, that aren't competitive, and again, that also tend to be passionate about risk. Like, my job is figuring out what risk to accept or transfer. That we're not in the risk elimination business, and so these are great ways you can have. These are conversations you can have with someone outside of the cybersecurity function in ways that are impactful for that you can use and you can use to get them as advocates or sponsors for investment. So again, what information do we have? Who would want that? How valuable? The third question is one of my favorite. That there was a CISO years ago of an insurance company, And she would start all of her meetings with executives of the company is that, what is the most important and valuable things that your function does for the company? And they'd be like, oh man, I have HR, I run payroll. If we don't pay our employees, they would all quit. She's like, oh, so how do we protect payroll? And they're like, hooked. And so there's great questions. Again, they may not understand the technology, but would a nation state like China or North Korea want this? Would a financially motivated adversary want this? Those are conversations that an executive can understand. And if you do that before you get to what controls, you have them hooked into a conversation that can be much more compelling from an investment perspective. So, again, how do we take this to the dollars we're already spending? We talked about enriching instant response. Again, you can look at the attack chains. If you see, if you see a TTP that you've detected, if you have IOCs or other detections, does the attack chain make sense? You can really figure out, if I see this, what are the likely things that will be targeted? That you can increase the aim of your incident response process. And again, you can also detect false flags, so you're not misusing those resources. It's a great way, I think the DBIR data is really valuable. Their patterns data, and their patterns by industry. You can start to look at this around how you cluster your attacks, and you can bring a view of in your SIM of potential adversaries into the conversation. And then we just talked through very, very important in how you can enrich the budgeting process. Again, so here's what I encourage you to do is, if you haven't done this before, it's okay. Start with a blank slate. Do it beyond your security team. So the trilogy that Josh and I ended up was not intentional. Is the last presentation in the trilogy is about taking not just your sphere of control, but your sphere of influence, and building allies across the organization to help you drive your cybersecurity goals. So again, identify your most likely adversaries. That's a great place to get the operational folks in the business involved. Use that to drive, if you have capabilities to drive threat intelligence, if you're dealing with activists, brand chatter and monitoring, and if you're involved in ISACs or other information sharing organizations, it's a great way to drive frameworks in conversations around information sharing. And then I think the last thing that's really powerful is use this in tabletops. You can, instead of having we're having a ransomware outbreak, here are, where a financial motivated actor is doing this, when you bring it from the who to the what to the how to the why, that you can really transform the tabletop, and you can build a framework that's applicable over time. So with that, I am wrapping up, and I'm happy to take some questions. I think that's any questions from the group?
Everybody's so far away. I'm going to turn the...
Yep. 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 Yeah, so I'll try to summarize. I think the question was, when you think about risk, there are some very, very high impact risks that they've taken the critical infrastructure space, where the consequence could be loss of human life, or I think as Bryson Bort says that power and water are all that keep us from the Stone Ages, so very, very high consequence attacks, but again, very high complexity and very low. Therefore, very, very low likelihood. And I think that so yes, I think that what I've found is having that conversation, with executives is really important. One, the low likelihood. My experience is that the vulnerability side of low likelihood is actually a lot higher than people often realize it can be. And so I think, the conversation is around, the first parts of the adversarial equation is like, hey, so one is who would want to do this? Pretty easy to figure out state actors, other, from a pseudo military capability. Other actors, are much more complicated. But then talking about, what capability would be required to make this happen, and then you connect it with the vulnerability side. And I think what I've seen when you have those conversations is that the cost of the attack is generally way lower than executives realize it is. And so I found that to be pretty valuable. But I mean, in general, not necessarily a black swan event, but very high impact, very low. Very high impact, very low likelihood events are one of the hardest risks to get people on board with. But I think having the conversation from the adversary side does help. Josh has done a lot of great work on this. That if you Google, that's what brought him to Clarity. That he joined Clarity after his DHS service to really focus on that risk set. So, any other questions? Cool. Again, the slides will be available. Also, if you Google, my last name and Adversary ROI, you'll see that there's some more resource available. Actually, and one of the most flattering things in my career, some academics have taken this model and written some papers about it, which is something I never would have anticipated when Josh and I were sitting around a dinner table one night, started sketching this on a napkin. And feel free to reach out to either of us. Obviously, this is a passion of ours, and would love to be able to help more. Enjoy CornCon and have a great day.